policy on freedom of movement for Palestinians?
All right, thank you very much for coming this early. Let me just start by saying when Washington talks about the Israeli occupation, it usually, first of all, doesn't start by referring to it as that, as an occupation. It usually refers to it as a conflict. And when Washington discusses the conflict, finding a resolution to the conflict is generally within the framework of providing security for Israel and easing travel restrictions on Palestinians and addressing their humanitarian needs. This is sort of the refrain you hear whenever Obama is speaking, whenever anyone when is considered to have said something sympathetic to the Palestinians. It's usually in that context. Palestinians need, humanitarian assistance. Israelis need security. And it even prompted one Ahmed Musa at the time, head of the Arab League in the UN, to go out of his scheduled speech and jump onto the microphone in the UN and say, and Palestinians need security too. I remember a few years ago. But it's as though Palestinians were only concerned with food and the occasional reprieve, the occasional opening of a crossing every now and then, the easing of restrictions. And so I want to talk a little bit about this. I want to talk a little bit about this, what I consider this illogical paradigm, but specifically about what these so-called restrictions mean for Palestinians. Because a restriction, when you think of a restriction, and I've often faced this in speaking with Americans who don't know much about the conflict, it sounds like something really inconvenient at worst. The red line is delayed, the beltway is backed up, the Cherry Blossom Festival means that major streets are closed, and all of this can add up to extensive waits and annoyances, but in the end there's always another way around, right? You might have to wait for a couple of hours, but you can, reroute. But Israeli checkpoints, border closures, and permits, they do more than simply inconvenience Palestinians. They paralyze life and livelihoods, but they also dysfunctionalize families and economies. They're entrenched and systematic, and they're intended to drive Palestinians from their land, and they make up what Jeff Halper calls the Israeli matrix of control, and there is no other way around. There is no other way around. You just cannot find a way from Gaza to the West Bank, or from the West Bank to Gaza, or when a border crossing is closed, out of the West Bank, or into the West Bank, or into East Jerusalem. It's the equivalent of being a Maryland resident, which I am, and being told you can never set foot in Washington, D.C., or study at Georgetown, or use Dulles Airport, or take your children to a doctor's appointment at the Children's Hospital, or marry someone from the district. It's exactly like that. Palestinians in Gaza cannot study at Birzeit University. They cannot go to Tel HaShaber Hospital. They cannot marry someone from the West Bank and then live together. And it's vice versa as well. It also includes Palestinians living in Israel, by the way. They cannot marry Palestinians from the territories either. So let me talk in more detail about how Israel controls Palestinian movement, and I'll try to be brief because you can go on and on about this, but I'm going to begin with Gaza. So there's only one way in and out of the Gaza Strip for most Palestinians. That's the Rafah crossing. And it's jointly controlled by Egyptian and Israeli governments. The Egyptians manage the crossing on the ground, but the overriding system governing who can use it is still an Israeli one. When it is open, only Palestinians with an Israeli-issued ID card, known as the Hawiyya, the identity card, can use Rafah crossing to pass into Gaza. And remember, Gaza is supposed to be the place that is liberated and Israel no longer controls. That's why this is significant. Israel began issuing these cards when it occupied the Palestinian territories in 1967 and conducted a population census there. And the cards have ever since been used to control Palestinian movement and the Palestinian population registry very significantly. They are location specific. A Gaza ID may only be used to enter Gaza, not the West Bank, and vice versa. And the most stringent conditions are placed on Palestinians carrying East Jerusalem ID cards. The 250,000 Palestinians with these Israeli-issued East Jerusalem ID cards have the same legal status as people who immigrated to Israel, meaning Jews who've gone to Israel, but they're not entitled to citizenship and they're not entitled to a lot of other things. So they're considered non-citizen residents. They can lose their ID cards simply by not being in Jerusalem for 5 years, by studying abroad, for example, and by not paying a series of really absurd taxes. All of this can mean that their identity will be revoked, and they, just as I was saying, no longer have a right to set foot in the city or live there, that they've been born and raised in their entire lives. In the West Bank, more than 600 checkpoints, barriers, trenches, obstacles, fragment Palestinian land and sever towns from one another. And there too, Israel's separation barrier, along with illegal settlements, buffer zones, seam lines, effectively annex half of Palestinian land. Fixing all this requires more than an occasional easing of closures, as I started out by saying, which does little more than ease political pressure and media attention away from politicians and governments. This summer, when I was in Gaza, I was continuously told by Palestinians that what they desired was freedom, not food. Freedom to study in the West Bank or other universities, like Birzeit or abroad. Freedom to farm without being killed, which many Palestinian farmers and shepherds frequently are when they are farming their land in the buffer zone. Freedom to fish more than 3 nautical miles into sea, which is the latest restriction placed on fishermen there as part of the maritime blockade. Freedom to do the ordinary things that make our lives what they are. But these are exactly the kinds of things that the US policy, the unrestricted aid dollars and blind support of Israel, prevent ordinary Palestinians from doing. And as President Obama himself acknowledged in his Cairo speech, Israeli closure policies are strategically unsound and harm Israel's security. But we have yet to see these words transformed into action on the ground. Now, true freedom of movement, access for both goods and people, because at the moment, pretty much most goods are not being allowed out of Gaza, just as people are not being allowed to. These things require addressing the underlying problem, creating the restrictions to start with, the Israeli occupation and effective control over the Palestinian territories. And as I say, friends don't let friends run an occupation. So, why all the attention on Israel is the frequent retort. So what? There's lots of other repressive regimes. Israel gets more aid from the United States than any other nation on the planet. President Obama, as many of us know, recently approved a $3 billion aid package there. The aid is unrestricted and comes with no strings attached, so it can be used for any purpose. They don't need to, itemize it or whatever, and it doesn't need to be paid back. But the aid is not going to help a struggling developing nation. Not that it usually does, but anyway. The aid goes to, among other things, making sure people like my husband, who is a Palestinian with refugee status, cannot come visit Gaza. Or Ibrahim, a young IT entrepreneur I met this summer in Gaza, from attending conferences. Or Muhammad, a young college student in Gaza, from continuing his studies in the West Bank University of Birzeit, from which he was deported by Israeli authorities last year, along with hundreds of other Palestinians. He was literally just plucked, blindfolded, and thrown onto the Erez crossing and told to go back to Gaza. All of this is in line with the policy to separate Gaza from the West Bank, which is, by the way, now an official declared Israeli policy. Or Eman, a Palestinian from the West Bank currently stuck in Jordan, from crossing the Allenby Bridge to rejoin her children and husband in Nablus because she was denied entry to her own home by Israeli authorities on her way back to the West Bank. Or Sahar, a Palestinian student from East Jerusalem, from retaining her residency status there because she was studying abroad. This is what our Israel aid dollars do. But they also go to further Palestinian division and embolden the blockade on Gaza, as revealed in the CIA attempt to sabotage Palestinian unity. We should also be clear about what the intentions of Israeli policies towards Palestinians are, because they have been systematic and consistent over the past years. This is not something new. Again, the discourse would have us believe that it is a response or retaliation to something. It's what the late Israeli scholar Baruch Kimmerling called politicide, a gradual but systematic attempt to cause the annihilation of an independent political and social entity. Now, in line with this, it has been Israeli policy for years to prevent viable Palestinian statehood indefinitely. And this isn't, the conspiracy theorist in me or anyone else talking. Ariel Sharon's top advisor referred to the Gaza disengagement of 2005 as formaldehyde, intended to achieve just that, freeze the political process. That was a direct quote from him. It is calculated and premeditated, and it's not a retaliation or self-defense to some latest series of security threats. We should be clear about that. The US-supported blockade on Gaza falls within this framework. Its aim is clear, and I quote, to keep Gaza on the brink of collapse. This is a direct quote from recently revealed WikiLeaks cables between Israeli and American embassies in 2008. And a recent Israeli army presentation elaborates further, explaining that Israeli goals are now to create two separate entities. Sever Gaza from the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and prevent the movement of people and goods in and out of Gaza. So in conclusion, we're witnessing tectonic changes in the Arab world, and it is the opinion of some that it is uncharted territory for the United States. The event that has taken place and the events that continue to take place have been unexpected and unpredicted. But critically, they mean the U.S. can no longer support repressive client regimes in the name of maintaining a temporary stability and security at the expense of freedom, civil rights, and human dignity. And Israel is no exception to this. Thank you.